The protests outside the White House in Washington are not isolated demonstrations. They are part of a larger pattern of discontent that is crystallizing around the presidency of Donald Trump in his second term. Crowds gathering in Lafayette Square may seem like the typical spectacle of American political opposition, yet the deeper currents are found not in the chants of the protesters, but in the numbers that now circulate across policy circles, media outlets, and foreign capitals. Recent national polling, including the latest survey by the Pew Research Center, reveals a decisive and widening gap between the American public and its president on the most critical questions of foreign policy and governance. These figures are not merely approval ratings, they are strategic indicators of legitimacy, credibility, and capacity to govern in moments of crisis. When asked whether they have confidence in President Trump to handle the war between Ukraine and Russia, Americans expressed doubt by an 18-point margin. That is not a minor fluctuation. It is a deep structural deficit in political trust. Confidence in presidential leadership during war has historically served as a stabilizing anchor for the American political system. Franklin Roosevelt maintained broad, bipartisan confidence during the Second World War. George W. Bush, in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, experienced a surge of support that allowed for expansive policy initiatives. The erosion of that confidence under Trump, by contrast, points to a fragmentation of the political center. It reveals a public not only skeptical of decisions in Eastern Europe, but also uncertain whether its leadership can sustain alliances, manage escalation, or deter adversaries. An 18-point deficit on the single most pressing security crisis in Europe since the Cold War does not remain a domestic statistic. It becomes a data point interpreted by Moscow, by Kyiv, and by NATO capitals in Brussels, Berlin, and Warsaw. In the logic of geopolitics, perceived weakness at home projects vulnerability abroad. The Pew poll did not stop at Ukraine. It extended across other flashpoints that together form the architecture of American foreign policy. On Iran, Americans registered a 12-point deficit in confidence regarding Trump's ability to handle that file. Iran, a state with nuclear ambitions and regional proxy networks, represents one of the most volatile theaters of potential escalation in the Middle East. A 12-point deficit is not catastrophic on its own, but in the cumulative picture, it contributes to an image of an administration broadly distrusted on multiple fronts. On energy policy, the results are starker. Americans were not confident in Trump's ability to make wise decisions on global energy issues by an 18-point margin. Energy is not an isolated sector. It underpins the dollar, supply chains, inflation, and the very capacity of the West to sustain sanctions regimes against adversaries like Russia and Iran. An 18-point deficit on energy competence suggests a disconnect between the administration's tariff and sanction strategies and the lived reality of American households confronting high prices at the pump and volatility in heating and electricity bills. The same poll asked about confidence in Trump's ability to work effectively with American allies. Here, too, the results pointed to deficit. An 11-point margin of doubt emerged. This question strikes at the core of America's grand strategy, which since the Second World War has depended on alliances to amplify power, project deterrence, and stabilize regions. If the American public believes its president cannot manage alliances effectively, adversaries will assume those alliances are brittle. Such perception shifts the calculus in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. For China, in particular, the question of alliance management is tied to the Indo-Pacific strategy. Doubt about Trump's handling of China itself was reflected in the poll. Confidence was lacking not only on China, but on Canada, on Israel, and on the broader fabric of bilateral relations. Each deficit becomes a fragment in a mosaic of declining trust. Public skepticism is not confined to abstract confidence levels. It extends to specific policy evaluations. On tariff policy, Americans disapprove by a 23-point margin. Tariffs have been central to Trump's vision of economic nationalism and strategic decoupling, particularly with China, but increasingly also with India and Europe. Disapproval at this scale suggests not only elite pushback, but also popular resistance to higher consumer prices, supply chain disruptions, and retaliatory measures abroad. If tariffs are the economic instrument of a broader geopolitical strategy, then public disapproval undermines the domestic foundation upon which that strategy rests. The erosion of trust spreads further into governance itself. 14 points underwater on making good decisions about foreign policy overall. 15 points underwater on managing the executive branch effectively. 26 points underwater on the broader effect the president is having on how the federal government works in Washington. These are not isolated figures. They represent a convergence of doubt across foreign and domestic domains. They signify a perception that the presidency is not a source of stability, but a multiplier of dysfunction. 26 points underwater on governance is not simply about partisan opposition. It reflects a cross-cutting sense that institutions are being weakened rather than strengthened. Beyond competence, the Pew survey probed questions of character. Would Americans describe Trump as honest? By a margin of 26 points, the answer was no. Would they consider him a good role model? By a margin of 41 points, the answer was again no. These numbers strike at the moral authority of leadership, which, while intangible, has historically mattered for the legitimacy of U.S. foreign engagements. During the Cold War, American presidents often invoked not only military power, but also moral clarity in the contest with Soviet communism. A deficit of honesty and role model status diminishes the capacity to rally allies and to claim normative leadership in global affairs. Then there is the Epstein matter. 70% of Americans disapproved of the administration's handling of information related to the government's investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. 70% is not a typical fluctuation. It is a supermajority. It indicates a crisis of trust at the intersection of governance, justice, and elite networks. Within that controversy, Fox News reported that the deputy director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Dan Bonino, was effectively out of his position after clashing with the administration over the redaction of Trump's name from case files. If accurate, the episode illustrates not merely a personnel shift, but a fracture between federal law enforcement and the executive branch over transparency in matters of public scandal. When 70% of Americans disapprove of the handling of such a case, the problem is not partisan polarization, it is systemic legitimacy. The Justice Department, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, faced a deadline to release Epstein-related materials to the House Oversight Committee. The department signaled it would not meet the deadline. Such defiance of legislative oversight amplifies perceptions of opacity and suppression. In a constitutional system predicated on checks and balances, refusal to comply with oversight deadlines becomes another marker of executive resistance to accountability. Combined with public disapproval, it deepens the perception of a presidency estranged from the rule of law. The cumulative effect of these polling figures is stark. Overall, Trump's approval rating is underwater by 22 points. 22 points is not merely a downturn, it is structural collapse. Within the breakdown, the intensity of disapproval matters even more than the aggregate numbers. 27% of Americans strongly approve of Trump. 47% strongly disapprove. The gap between strong disapproval and strong approval is 20 points. That gap matters. It signals that opposition is not only broad but deeply entrenched. A president can sometimes govern with low approval if support is soft but malleable. Entrenched, strong disapproval, by contrast, hardens political divisions and reduces the space for recovery. The last time approval numbers for Trump were this low was immediately after January 6th of 2021, when the storming of the Capitol placed the Republic under direct stress. To see similar figures in 2025 suggests that the legitimacy crisis is not episodic but chronic. Nearly half the country now describes itself as strongly disapproving of the president. That level of entrenched opposition creates a political environment in which governance becomes increasingly difficult, not only domestically but also in projecting power internationally. Allies question the durability of commitments made by a president who lacks domestic legitimacy. Adversaries calculate that time and attrition will weaken American resolve. In authoritarian systems, elections are often managed or suppressed to avoid the expression of popular discontent. In the American system, elections remain the mechanism through which discontent translates into institutional change. Yet, an authoritarian-minded leader with approval numbers this disastrous, may begin to view elections themselves as a threat rather than as a validation. That is the strategic danger. When legitimacy erodes at home, the temptation to consolidate power through extraordinary means rises. The polls are therefore not merely about popularity. They are early warning indicators of potential democratic erosion, from Ukraine to Iran, from tariffs to energy, from alliances to domestic governance. The numbers point in one direction, downward. They reveal an administration beset not only by policy challenges, but by a structural deficit of trust. The protests outside the White House are therefore not the cause, but the symptom. The true story lies in the erosion of legitimacy that is reshaping the relationship between the presidency, the American public, and the global order. This erosion does not remain confined to Washington. It reverberates through NATO summits, G7 meetings, energy markets, and diplomatic negotiations. It alters the calculus of adversaries and allies alike. The Cold War taught that perception of legitimacy matters as much as tanks and missiles. In 2025, as the United States navigates conflicts abroad and crises at home, perception once again becomes a decisive strategic factor. The Pew numbers, the disapproval margins, the entrenched opposition, these are not ephemeral statistics. They are the contours of a legitimacy crisis that will shape not only the trajectory of the Trump presidency, but the role of the United States in the international system. The protests outside the White House are visible. The erosion of confidence beneath them is invisible, but it is far more consequential for the global balance of power.